We step into this story burdened with a silent confidence, the belief that the modern world, armed with satellites, algorithms, and data maps, finally sees the Earth as it truly is. That only now, in this age of digital omniscience, have we escaped the fog that shrouded our ancestors. But what if this confidence is not a sign of clarity, but a symptom of amnesia? What if ancient civilizations, long buried and dismissed, once understood something we have forgotten, not through equations and electronics, but through cycles, passions, and memory? We do not begin this inquiry in the recent centuries of recorded history. We must retreat tens of thousands of years into deep time, to a world before writing, before cities, before the arrogance of permanence, a world where the Earth was not a backdrop, but a force. And survival meant reading its signs not once, but over generations. At such a distance, modern maps dissolve, nations vanish, technologies disappear like footprints in sand. What remains are the long, slow cycles that have always governed this planet, patterns so immense that no single life can perceive them in full. Yet so powerful they shape the rise and fall of entire civilizations. Today, we assign these rhythms clinical names: orbital shifts, solar variations, climate oscillations, tidal surges, magnetic reversals. But ancient people did not speak in graphs. They watched, felt, remembered. They organized their lives around the whispers of Earth's rhythms, carving meaning into stone and story so the next generation could endure what they could not control. Imagine life without fossil fuels, without refrigeration, without the buffering comfort of global trade. In that world, every shift in rainfall, every change in temperature, every failed harvest is not a statistic, it is a reckoning. Climate change in such a world is not theoretical, it is immediate. And collapse is not a future threat, it is a present sentence. In such a world, the sky is not symbolic, it is strategic. Stories are not fantasy, they are archives. Myths are not inventions, they are memory compressed into poetry. Time to survive through fire and flood. If civilization is a temporary truce with the elements, then myths are its field manuals, teaching us what to do when that truce breaks. It is tempting to believe that our ancestors misunderstood the world, that they huddled in ignorance and filled the void with gods and demons. But the more we uncover, the more that assumption unravels. Civilizations across continents, from the highlands of Peru to the Nile Delta, left behind records not in books, but in alignments, constructions, rituals, and what they consistently suggest is not a blind worship of the unknown, but a deliberate engagement with the cycles they observed. These societies did not watch the sky for comfort. They watched it to survive. They mapped the sun's return, the moon's path, the stars' slow drift across the horizon, because within those movements lay the clues to what would happen below. Flood, drought, wind, cold. These were not random events. They were consequences. And if these civilizations fell, it was not because they lacked knowledge. It was because knowledge does not grant immunity. It grants foresight, but not control. And foresight, without the ability or willingness to act, becomes a burden. What makes this realization unsettling is what it implies about us. We possess more information than any civilization before us. We can detect the faintest wobble in the planet's axis, measure sea temperatures from pole to pole, forecast tomorrow's weather with near-perfect accuracy. But we remain blind to the future, not because we lack the tools, but because we no longer live according to what those tools reveal. Modern civilization thrives on linearity, the belief that time flows forward in progress, that the past was confusion and the future is clarity. But the Earth moves in loops. Cycles turn, diverge, realign. Systems evolve, reset. When we mistake stability for permanence, we mistake the quiet before a shift for proof that no shift is coming. But ancient societies knew better. Their calendars were not just for harvest, they were warnings. Their temples were not only for gods, they were instruments of measurement. And their stories, as strange as they may seem, may contain truths too vast for prose and too urgent for forgetfulness. Before we go any deeper into this mystery, a small request. If you're still with us now, watching from wherever you are in the world, let us know in the comments. What time is it where you are? What brought you here? And does the title of this story make more sense to you now? If it does, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. And if you find this story compelling, share it. Someone else may be waiting to hear it at just the right moment. Consider this. If humanity is not at the beginning of understanding, but at the edge of forgetting, then the stakes are not just historical, they are existential. The question is not whether ancient people had advanced science. It is whether they had a perspective we have abandoned, a way of seeing the Earth as a living system, not a resource, a partner, not a possession. And in that view, collapse is not an accident. It is a recurring outcome when societies exceed their ability to adapt to the rhythms they once respected. The lesson of forgotten civilizations is not that they were wrong about the world. It is that they were right to be cautious. And that caution decays faster than stone. It is this decay of memory, this erosion of perspective, that leaves us vulnerable. We respond to immediate crises while ignoring converging patterns. We plan for the next quarter, not the next century. We mistake resilience for strength, optimization for wisdom, and so we drift further from the rhythms that once governed human life. Replacing cyclical awareness with digital distraction, we can name the Milankovitch cycles, chart magnetic reversals, predict solar flares. But we do not build our civilizations with these forces in mind. We build them as if they are irrelevant. Perhaps that is our greatest delusion, that by knowing more, we are safer. But the Earth has never cared how much we know. It responds only to how we act. And if our knowledge does not translate into alignment with its cycles, then we are not different from those who came before. We are only better informed as we walk the same path. The ancient question was never, can we understand the Earth? It was always, can we live with it? That difference is the boundary between endurance and collapse. In the end, what remains is not the story of triumph, but the story of return. The cycles do not stop. They wait. They recur. And if we do not listen to them, not with equations, but with humility, we will join the long list of civilizations who thought themselves the exception, who believed the sky no longer needed to be read, who forgot that the Earth is not a stage, but a player in every story we tell. Long before the invention of writing, the first records were inscribed not in ink or stone, but in light and shadow. The sky became humanity's earliest archive, a vast, shifting ledger written in cycles. The sun rose and fell with perfect rhythm, casting different shadows with every passing season. The moon waxed and waned in predictable grace. Stars rotated across the firmament, disappearing and reappearing in fixed sequences. These movements were not ornaments to a poetic sky, they were patterns essential to survival, to early civilizations teetering on the edge of sustenance. Such cosmic regularity was not mystical, but practical. The heavens were a calendar, a clock, and an oracle, all in one. In the absence of written language, the sky offered the most consistent framework by which to track time, anticipate change, and prepare for risk. This was not mere curiosity, it was a necessity born of precarious living. Entire civilizations rose around their capacity to read these celestial signs. Across continents and centuries, ancient peoples marked the solstices and equinoxes, the rising of certain stars, the phases of the moon. These observations were not randomly recorded but woven into ceremony, architecture, and mythology. Stone circles, pyramids, temples, and mounds were all instruments of precision, built not just to honor deities, but to measure when the rains would come, when the river would flood, when the cold would strike. Consider the great megalithic monuments of the Neolithic world. At Stonehenge, massive stones were aligned with pinpoint accuracy to frame the sunrise on the summer solstice. The structure was more than a temple, it was a calendar in stone. In the Americas, the Maya tracked not only the solar year, but a complex web of cycles involving Venus, the moon, and eclipses. Their cities and inscriptions show an astonishing command of temporal coordination, one that was not decorative but deeply functional. In Mesopotamia, some of the earliest written records are celestial charts, observations recorded by priest astronomers whose duty was not theological speculation, but civic guidance. The sky was used to inform agriculture, politics, and even warfare. Across cultures, the same impulse emerged: to track, to align, and interpret. Ancient Egyptians built temples whose corridors would flood with sunlight on only one day each year, often the solstice. To them, the rising of Sirius, visible just before dawn, signaled the flooding of the Nile, an event so essential to agriculture that it defined the structure of their year. This was not symbolic. It was strategy. In an environment where a missed season meant starvation, knowing the cycles of the sky was as important as knowing the land. Astronomy was not separate from spirituality or governance, it was embedded in them. Modern observers often err in separating the scientific from the symbolic. We see the precise celestial alignments and assume a dichotomy. Either these people were engineers or they were mystics. But the truth is more fluid. In ancient worlds, meaning and measurement coexisted. A star was not just a point of light, it was a signal, a reminder, a bearer of memory. Rituals were not just expressions of faith, they were mechanisms for transmitting information across generations. To encode memory into myth was to ensure that knowledge survived even when writing did not. The sky was not just observed, it was interpreted, narrated, lived. When floods recurred or droughts deepened, people looked upward, not out of superstition, but out of experience. The sky offered patterns, and patterns suggested cause and consequence. This is where mythology becomes more than metaphor. A flood myth, for instance, is not a forecast, but it is not fiction either. It compresses experience into story, preserving the memory of cataclysm in a form that can endure oral transmission. A generation that suffers disaster encodes its lesson in narrative. The next generation inherits the warning. Even if the data has faded, the flood story becomes a fable. The fable becomes ritual, and the ritual becomes a seasonal festival. And so, the memory survives altered, softened, but not lost. But even the most carefully observed cycles fade in urgency over time. When the environment stabilizes, vigilance decays. Ceremonies that once had critical timing become tradition. Calendars remain in use, but the reason for their precision is forgotten. The sun still rises. The moon still changes. But their messages are no longer heard with the same alertness. The sky becomes beautiful again instead of essential. And in that quiet forgetting, risk returns. Because the Earth's rhythms continue, whether we notice them or not. A society may stop watching the clock, but the clock keeps time regardless. We are left today with fragments, ruins aligned to forgotten stars, calendars without context, stories that speak of sun gods and moon beasts and floods without shores. These remnants are impressive, but they often appear disconnected. They are difficult to interpret without the framework that gave them meaning. But viewed through the lens of Earth's cycles, they begin to reassemble. We see that these were not just relics of belief, but instruments of understanding, that the sky was both a calendar and a warning system, and that when memory fails, the warning is no less real, only more silent. A stone temple that captures the solstice light is not just art, it is a data point frozen in architecture. A myth that tells of the sun vanishing or the moon bleeding red is not just poetry, it is a coded memory of eclipse, of drought, of unusual tides. These are messages in a bottle, cast into time. And they require more than translation, they require interpretation. When we encounter these artifacts, the question is not only what did they mean then, but what do they still mean now? Because the sky they studied is the same sky above us. What ancient civilizations built was not just infrastructure, it was continuity. They created systems that connected generations through shared observation. They understood that a season of failure might be survived, but a forgotten lesson might not. They tried to make memory last beyond collapse. Some succeeded, others did not. But their attempt was clear. They looked up, and in the turning of the heavens, they saw both danger and hope. They tried to remember, not because they were primitive, but because they were wise enough to know what forgetting would cost. The tragedy of history is not just the fall of cities, but the fall of memory. A society that ceases to read the sky is not just one that has turned inward, it is one that has begun to drift from the clock that governs all things. The earth moves in cycles. The heavens reflect them. And to look up is to remember that stability is not a promise, but a phase. What the ancients left behind is not only stone and myth, but an invitation to see what they saw, and to hear what they tried to preserve. The sky was their archive. It still is. Long before cities were built or stories were carved into stone, Earth was already breathing in slow, frozen cycles. Great sheets of ice crept from the poles like slow-moving beasts, grinding mountains into dust, swallowing forests, and draining oceans into their frozen bellies. Then, as quietly as they came, they melted, releasing water to flood valleys, redraw coastlines, and awaken dormant lands. These transformations were not random, they followed the deep, predictable rhythms of Earth's orbit. Today, we call them Milankovitch cycles, named for the Serbian scientist who realized that tiny shifts in the planet's tilt, wobble, and path around the sun could drive glacial periods and interglacial warmings over tens of thousands of years. But long before that knowledge was formalized, people were living through its consequences. To modern eyes, the end of an ice age looks like distant geology, but to those living near its edge, it was a world in transition. The temperature dropped not over days, but decades. The sun grew weaker in the sky. Seasons changed in length and intensity. Glaciers, once distant, began their advance silent, cold, and unstoppable. For those caught in their path, the signs were not abstract, they were carved into the land. Rivers shifted direction, lakes expanded or disappeared, animals migrated or died out. For generations that lived by hunting, foraging, or simple cultivation. These shifts were not just environmental, they were existential. We imagine ancient people as passive in the face of such transformations. But this assumption underestimates their capacity for adaptation and observation. Communities moved with the seasons, tracked animal migrations, and recognized the slow return of cold not as a mystery, but as a warning. In caves and rock shelters, they told stories of long winters and burning skies, of lands lost beneath water and others buried beneath snow. These were not exaggerations. They were recollections shaped by necessity. In some traditions, they became myths of punishment or cleansing. In others, tales of survival and rebirth. But beneath the narrative styles, a core truth remained. The earth had changed, and it could change again. Consider the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions that struck approximately 12,000 years ago. Just as the world seemed to be warming, the climate reversed course, plunging much of the northern hemisphere back into icy conditions. The change was abrupt, and severe average temperatures fell. Rainfall patterns shifted, and regions once habitable became marginal within a few generations. Archaeological records show widespread disruption. Settlements were abandoned. Plant and animal populations changed dramatically. For those living through it, this was not just weather, it was apocalypse. And yet, communities survived. They moved. They adapted. They remembered. It is in the aftermath of this event that we begin to see something extraordinary. Around 11,000 years ago, as the climate stabilized once more, human civilization began to accelerate. Agriculture took root in the Fertile Crescent. Permanent settlements emerged. Monumental architecture appeared. Writing followed soon after. It was as if humanity had waited for the planet to steady itself before stepping forward. But this raises an uncomfortable question: what came before? During the last glacial maximum, sea levels were over 100 meters lower than they are today. Entire coastlines that would have been ideal for settlement are now submerged, hidden beneath shallow seas and continental shelves. If any sophisticated cultures existed there, their remains are inaccessible or destroyed. The absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. In fact, given how much land was lost to rising seas, it would be surprising if nothing significant had developed in those drowned regions. What little we know comes from fragments, stone tools found underwater, submerged cave art, oral histories from coastal peoples. These hints suggest that human knowledge did not suddenly begin with farming, but may have survived previous collapses. When the ice retreated, it was not just the cold that disappeared. It was the memory of what once existed at the edge of the ice. Memory drowned along with the land. This is where flood myths enter the picture. Found in nearly every culture, these stories speak of rising waters, vanishing lands, and the survival of a chosen few. In some, the flood is divine punishment. In others, it is a natural disaster endured with courage. Despite their differences, they share a remarkable consistency, a moment when the world changed so completely that only fragments remained. From Mesopotamia's Epic of Gilgamesh to indigenous American traditions, to Hindu cosmology and the biblical story of Noah, the narrative is the same. Water rises. The old world ends. A remnant survives. For centuries, these myths were dismissed as allegories, but when viewed through the lens of glacial retreat and sea level rise, they resemble something else entirely: cultural memory of real, planet-scale disruption. What makes these stories powerful is not just their survival, but the way they preserve information. When writing is rare, the burden of memory falls to storytelling. A myth becomes a vessel for warnings, advice, and clues. Build high, watch the sky, respect the tides. These are not just themes, they are encoded strategies. A civilization that had seen the sea swallow cities might teach its children through ritual to fear the ocean, to place its temples on high ground, to record the stars so that changes could be tracked. These are not superstitions. They are attempts to survive recurrence. But awareness is not immunity. Even with understanding, a civilization can be overwhelmed when multiple cycles converge. Rising temperatures alone are a challenge. Add in flooding, drought, changing ecosystems, and possibly social upheaval, and the system strains beyond repair. The archaeological record often shows signs of sophisticated culture, only to find that it vanished with little trace. Temples buried in sediment, canals choked with silt, cities forgotten beneath new coastlines. These are not stories of ignorance. They are stories of knowledge outpaced by forces beyond control. The deep cycles of Earth do not move with drama. They move with certainty. A glacier does not arrive in a day. A sea does not rise overnight. But when they move with consequences that last for millennia. What survives is not just ruin, but silence. Knowledge fragmented into broken myths. Alignments that no longer match the sky. Symbols whose meanings are lost. The survivors rebuild. But they do not inherit the full memory. They begin again, piecing together a world they believe is new, unaware that they stand in the footprints of those who came before. To understand collapse is to understand forgetting, not just forgetting how to build, but forgetting why it mattered, why the temple faced the horizon, why the floodplain was avoided, why the story of the long winter was told each year. These were not idle tales, they were guides, and when they are lost, the cycle begins again. Another rise, another fall, another silence. What the return of the ice teaches us is that the world is not static. It has shifted before, and it will shift again. The only question is whether we will remember in time or whether we too will become myth. As the last great glaciers melted, the oceans did not merely rise, they reached out and erased the edges of history. What once were valleys became bays. Plains turned into seafloors. Coastal shelves that had supported generations of human life vanished under waves that knew no mercy. These submerged landscapes are not just geographical features, they are missing chapters. Erased libraries of early human civilization. When we look at the story of humanity and wonder why so much appears to begin around 12,000 years ago, we must consider not only what survived, but what was drowned. The coasts are where people gathered, traded, and flourished. And when the waters rose, the evidence of that flourishing was swept away. In modern times, archaeology leans heavily on land. Most of our discoveries come from dry terrain, temples in deserts, cities under forests, bones in caves. But during the last ice age, vast areas of now submerged seafloor were dry land, including areas that would have made ideal homelands, fertile, flat, and temperate. These now lost lands could have supported extensive human networks. Places like Doggerland between Britain and Europe, the Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, and the Bering Land Bridge between Siberia and the Americas were real, habitable regions. People lived there, built there, died there. But when the seas came, they did not leave ruins behind. They left silence. This silence distorts our perspective. Civilizations that once thrived on ancient coastlines left behind no obvious monuments. Not because they were primitive, but because the ocean is not a gentle curator. It grinds, buries, and hides. Structures of wood and clay disintegrate. Stone scatters. even metal corrides. And so we are left with the illusion that humanity's story began inland, with farming villages on riverbanks. But what if that is only the record of survivors, the last, scattered remnants of older systems that once flourished where the sea now rolls? Some researchers and divers have found tantalizing clues. Submerged structures off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean hint at ancient human activity. These are not confirmed cities, but patterns too deliberate to dismiss aligned stones, shaped platforms, underwater walls. Oral traditions in these regions often describe the sea taking land suddenly, washing away temples, or swallowing entire kingdoms. In Southeast Asia, for example, the story of Atlantis finds echoes in local legends of lost islands and sunken empires. These stories, once treated as pure fantasy, now raise different questions. What happens when cultural memory outlasts physical evidence? Flood myths again rise to prominence. If we see them not as allegories but as recollections, compressed memories of real, observed events, then their repetition across the world becomes less mysterious and more tragic. Each story marks a line in the collective human experience where the sea moved forward and the land was lost. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians recorded tales of great floods that reshaped the world. Aboriginal Australians tell of the ocean coming to reclaim land, reshaping coastlines their ancestors once walked. In North America, indigenous tribes speak of rivers rising to the tops of trees and the animals fleeing to the highest hills. These are not metaphors. They are echoes. Imagine a thriving coastal culture. Generations have lived by the sea. Trade routes link villages. Knowledge flows with the tides. Then, year by year, the shoreline creeps inward. Fields turn brackish. Wells go salty. Crops fail. The elders recall old stories, warnings whispered across time. But the change seems slow, manageable, until it isn't. A storm, a sudden surge, a season of high tides beyond expectation. Homes are swallowed. The people retreat, not with grandeur, but with urgency. And what they carry is not architecture, but story. A narrative that begins. Once, the land was farther out. Arver, with Soldanxes, the survivors rebuild inland. But the knowledge that once guided the old civilization, the astronomy aligned to a specific horizon, the ritual's time to a now submerged equinox point is fractured. It no longer matches the new sky. The memory decays. The myth becomes symbolic, detached from its origins. And when archaeologists arrive 10,000 years later, they find pottery, bones, simple tools. They see a beginning, but in truth, they are seeing a restart. What was lost beneath the waves was not just territory, it was context. Some ancient engineering reflects this awareness. In parts of South America, India, and the Middle East, there are raised platforms, sacred mounds, and elevated temples that appear oddly high for regions with no mountains. These were not merely spiritual ascents, they may have been flood precautions. To build above the high water line was not vanity, but memory made stone. It was the act of a people who remembered rising waters, who had heard the ocean knocking before. But even these elevated sanctuaries were not safe forever. As sea levels rose, entire landscapes were reshaped, rivers rerouted, marshes expanded. Once useful locations became untenable. Over time, the survivors adapted. They developed new systems, moved to higher ground, or shifted to inland valleys. But the knowledge of what came before the full sweep of a civilization lost to the ocean was not preserved in writing. It lingered in songs, in the names of hills, in the vague outlines of forbidden zones and sacred coasts. These fragments became the roots of myths, stories of ancient giants, of sunken cities, of gods who once walked the shores. They seem fantastical because we lack the records to anchor them, but their persistence suggests more than coincidence. The earth does not mourn what it takes. The sea offers no apology. And yet, the patterns it follows are not chaotic. The melting of ice, the rise of oceans, the flooding of coasts, these are cycles. They have happened before. They will happen again. The tragedy is not that they occur. It is that each time, humanity seems surprised. We resettle coastal cities. We build vast ports on flat deltas. We push deeper into flood-prone zones. And we treat myths of flooding as fiction, even as the tides rise around us once more. If ancient civilizations were guided by Earth cycles, then the loss of coastal homelands was not a mystery to them. It was a known threat, one they tried to remember. That memory was encoded in monuments, in elevated sanctuaries, and in flood narratives told around fires. But when those messages were lost or dismissed, the consequences were not delayed, they were repeated. We stand today on coasts that may have hosted forgotten worlds. We build on sediment deposited by ancient floods. We pave over memory and call it progress. But the sea remembers, and it does not need to return quickly to change everything. The forgotten shores beneath the sea are not silent. They speak in silt and sonar, in stories and in gaps. They remind us that much of what we call history is only what remained dry. The rest, the oldest and perhaps the wisest chapters, may lie just beyond the surf line, waiting for us to look not forward, but down, and to listen not to the land we know, but to the sea that took the rest. The ocean is not a passive boundary. It is a force with memory, a vast circulatory system that governs heat, hunger, abundance, and collapse. Ancient civilizations knew this intuitively. Long before scientific models gave names to its rhythms, they learned that the sea could be generous, delivering food, rain, and trade, but that it could also turn without warning into a destructive tide that unmade what it had once sustained. Unlike rivers, which could be tamed, or hills, which could be scaled, the ocean's moods were felt but never controlled. Its great movements unfolded over years, not days, making them difficult to predict, yet devastating when misunderstood. In the modern world, we describe one of the most influential of these cycles as the El Niño Southern Oscillation, a seesaw rhythm between ocean and atmosphere that shifts every few years. During El Niño, warm water accumulates in the eastern Pacific, altering rainfall patterns across the globe. Some regions drown while others wither. Fish disappear. Storms intensify. Crops fail. La Niña, its counterpart, brings opposite effects but not balance. The system amplifies extremes, and while this phenomenon is now tracked by satellites and modeled by computers, ancient people knew it through pain, through pattern, through persistent loss. Along the coasts of the Americas, especially in the Andes, archaeological layers tell the story. Great fishing cultures once thrived on the cold, nutrient-rich waters drawn up by coastal upwelling. These waters sustained fish, birds, and humans alike. But during powerful El Niño years, that cold water vanished. Warm currents smothered the ecosystem. Fish migrated or died. Harvests shrank. Social order faltered. Entire regions were abandoned, not because of war, but because the sea stopped providing. Irrigation canals were left to dry and crack. Granaries were emptied and not refilled. In the face of repeated oceanic betrayal, people moved. Civilizations reset. This pattern is not unique to South America. Across the Pacific, similar rhythms shaped life in Southeast Asia and Polynesia. Monsoon rains critical to agriculture and freshwater supply depended on the ocean's thermal pulse. When the timing shifted, so did the rains. Too late, and crops failed. Too early, and floods destroyed settlements. These weren't occasional misfortunes. They were recurring hazards. Oral traditions from Indonesia, India, and Pacific Islanders all speak of years when the seas turned hot, when rains failed, and when survival required not just strength, but foresight. Navigation by stars was matched by navigation through memory. These disruptions were not catastrophic every time, but that's what made them dangerous. A harsh year can be endured. A few poor seasons can be managed. But when instability becomes the norm, the systems built on stability begin to unravel. Ancient societies tried to adapt. They stored food, built complex networks of trade, diversified their crops. But each adaptation required energy, organization, and time. When multiple disruptions aligned, El Niño, drought, storms, disease, their resilience was tested beyond its limits. What's remarkable is how many myths across the world treat the sea not as a landscape but as a character capricious, powerful, alive. This is not primitive anthropomorphism. It is metaphor forged by necessity. The sea gave and then took. It taught in cycles. In Peruvian lore, the ocean is tied to gods who bring bounty one year and famine the next. In Polynesian legends, sea spirits demand respect, offering safe passage only when appeased. In Indian epics, the sea swells with divine anger, consuming lands that dared to forget its strength. These tales echo with a recognition. The ocean has memory, and when its rhythms are forgotten, it punishes not with malice, but with indifference. We know now that El Niño has been shaping human history for thousands of years. Scientists analyzing sediment layers, ice cores, and coral growth patterns have traced its signature across the ages. And the alignment is clear. Periods of social upheaval, cultural fragmentation, and population decline often coincide with oceanic instability. The sea did not destroy cities directly. It shifted wind patterns, reduced fish stocks, altered rainfall. These changes didn't look like enemies. They looked like bad luck. But the result was the same: displacement, conflict, collapse. In places like the Moche civilization of Peru, we see this vividly. Artifacts show a complex society with rich religious practices and advanced engineering. Their survival depended on predictable climate. But as El Niño events grew more intense and frequent, their strategies failed. Rituals turned more desperate. Sacrifices increased. Infrastructure decayed. Eventually, their cities were abandoned, not in one sweeping disaster, but in a slow withdrawal. The ocean had changed its tune, and the people who once danced to its rhythm could no longer keep pace. Modern scholars often hesitate to assign environmental causes to societal collapse. They point, rightly, to social, political, and economic factors. But those factors are not separate from the environment, they are shaped by it. A king cannot rule a starving population. A merchant cannot trade without goods. A priest loses authority when the rains stop and the ceremonies fail. The sea may not appear on ancient battlefields, but its absence is often written in the silence that follows. Some societies preserved knowledge of these cycles. Coastal communities in the Pacific kept long oral records of past disruptions, using them to plan migrations or shift their strategies. Stories were passed not just for entertainment, but as guidance. This island once flooded. The fish vanish when the sea warms. These lessons were not abstract. They were roadmaps for survival. But such knowledge was fragile. It relied on memory, on continuity, en transmission. A few broken links, a war, a plague, a forced migration, and the pattern faded. The ocean stayed the same, but the people forgot its song. This forgetting is the true danger. El Niño has not become more unpredictable. It has simply returned in a world that no longer listens the way it once did. And as global temperatures rise, the baseline shifts. The same pulses now bring greater extremes. Coastal cities today face floods that ancient societies would have marked as omens. Fisheries collapse not in distant villages, but in industrial nations. And while satellites warn us weeks in advance, the warnings often go unheeded, drowned in noise, politics, or delay. If the ocean has memory, then so must we. The ancient civilizations that survived longest were not those who mastered the sea, but those who respected it. They built with flexibility, not permanence. They adapted quickly, listened closely, and passed on what they learned. They understood that the sea's generosity was conditional, that abundance was not a guarantee, but a phase. And when that phase ended, survival depended on humility, not hubris. We are not so different. Our ships are faster, our models more accurate, our technology more advanced. But the ocean does not care how we measure it. It cares only that we remember, that we plan not just for calm, but for storm, that we treat the patterns of the past as prophecy, not coincidence. Because when the waters shift, as they always have, they will not ask if we are ready. They will simply arrive. And only those who still hear the rhythm will know how to move with the tide. High above the Earth's surface, invisible rivers of air race around the globe. These are the jet streams, powerful, fast-moving currents that act as atmospheric borders. They divide hot and cold, wet and dry. And under normal conditions, they hold winter in its place. But when these rivers weaken or begin to meander, their grip falters. Arctic air spills southward. The cold escapes its cage. What was once a predictable season becomes a prolonged freeze. And the balance that civilizations depend on begins to unravel. Ancient societies did not have satellites or weather balloons to detect these changes. But they lived under their effects. They noticed when winters arrived early and stayed too long, when crops failed without warning, and when rivers froze in places where they never had before. Across the northern hemisphere, legends tell of winters that lasted for years. In Norse mythology, Fimbulwinter, the great winter, precedes the end of the world. In Russian folklore, the frost is personified as a force that can both protect and punish. In Celtic stories, a veil of snow separates the worlds of the living and the dead. These myths are not merely poetic expressions of seasonal hardship. They echo something deeper, a memory of atmospheric instability, of years when the cold came uninvited and refused to leave. And in these legends, the cold is not a slow decline, it is an invasion, a wall breached, a force let loose. Scientific evidence supports the reality behind the stories. In the archaeological and paleoclimatic record, abrupt cooling events appear like scars. Tree rings from ancient forests show years of stunted growth. Pollen records indicate sudden changes in vegetation. Ice cores reveal drops in temperature that occurred not over centuries, but sometimes within a single generation. One of the most dramatic examples is the Younger Dryas, a sharp return to glacial conditions around 12,000 years ago. Temperatures plummeted, Rainfall patterns changed. Habitats shifted. For the humans of that time, it would have felt like nature reversed itself without warning. And while the exact trigger is debated, whether a meltwater pulse disrupted ocean currents or a comet struck the Earth, the result was clear. Winter wandered, and civilizations paused. What makes jet streams and polar vortexes so dangerous is not just their power, but their subtlety. Most of the time, they work quietly, shaping seasons with reliability. But when the balance of heat between the equator and the poles shifts, the jet stream weakens. It begins to loop and stagger, allowing Arctic air to reach farther south. This is not theoretical. Modern weather has shown us the results: unseasonal blizzards, deep freezes in southern latitudes, and unpredictable storm paths. For ancient societies without central heating or supply chains, such shifts were catastrophic. One failed harvest could be endured. Two could bring starvation. A third might lead to abandonment. Ancient architecture sometimes hints at responses to prolonged cold. Hearths become more central. Storage facilities increase in size. Settlement patterns shift to more sheltered areas. And in oral traditions, the memory of sudden winter becomes sacred. In some stories, it is a punishment. In others, a test. But always, it marks a turning point, the moment when the world became unfamiliar. The psychological impact of these events cannot be overstated. To see one's world freeze, to watch the sun rise lower each day and not return to its former strength, is to question not just survival, but reality itself. Jet stream failures do not destroy cities with fire or flood. They erode them slowly, through repetition. When abnormal winters occur back to back, societies begin to strain. Roads become impassable. Trade is disrupted. Animals die. Disease spreads in overcrowded shelters. Social cohesion weakens. People migrate in search of warmth and food. Borders become unstable. This slow unraveling does not look like collapse until, suddenly, it is. By the time the climate stabilizes, the society that endured the disruption may no longer exist in the form it once did. It has fragmented, transformed, or vanished. In many cultures, the idea of a northern force held back by an invisible boundary appears again and again. The Greeks spoke of Hyperborea, a land beyond the cold wind, untouched by winter. The Chinese described celestial barriers separating the heavenly realms. Indigenous Siberian myths speak of skies cracking open, releasing spirits of ice. Beneath the symbolism lies a shared truth, an awareness that the sky itself could shift, that protection was not permanent. The jet stream is invisible, but its behavior is not. It leaves a mark on landscapes and memories alike. The danger today is not that we lack knowledge, it is that we forget its implications. Modern civilization assumes a certain climatic predictability. Infrastructure, agriculture, and energy systems are built on assumptions of stability. But the jet stream does not honor those assumptions. When the Arctic warms, the temperature gradient that drives these high-altitude winds diminishes. The current weakens, meanders, stalls. The result is not always dramatic. Sometimes it means longer droughts, heat waves, or delayed rains. But in colder regions, it means winter overstaying its welcome again. We often treat extreme weather as isolated incidents. But when viewed in the context of shifting atmospheric boundaries, they form a pattern. Ancient people noticed it not through instruments, but through experience. They did not name it the jet stream. They named it myth, story, warning. Their response was not just practical, it was cultural. They embedded memory into tradition so that the next generation would remember to be cautious when the cold returned. This memory, however, is fragile. It fades when winters become mild. It weakens when decades pass without disruption. The wall holds, and people begin to assume it always will. They settle deeper into vulnerable zones. They optimize instead of preparing. And when the boundary breaks again, the response is confusion. Why is the river frozen? Why do the crops not sprout? Why is the sky different? By the time the pattern is recognized, options have narrowed. The society is no longer in control, it is reacting. Collapse does not always come with a roar. Sometimes it arrives as exhaustion, as the slow piling of unsolved problems, the weight of too many small losses, and when the jet stream falters, when winter wanders again. It is this weariness that breaks civilizations, not one single blow, but the grinding pressure of unmet needs. The people who come after may find ruins buried in snow and wonder why they were left behind. They may hear stories of a great cold and dismiss them as exaggerations, until the wind shifts again. The wall of wind is not fixed. It never was. It moves with the planet's temperature, with its oceanic pulses, with solar influence and volcanic ash. It is both boundary and messenger. And when it changes, it does not need to announce itself. It simply moves. Ancient civilizations tried to track its rhythm. Some succeeded, others did not. What remains is the knowledge that winter, like the sea, remembers. And when it returns, it brings with it all the forgotten lessons of its last arrival. Deep beneath our feet, molten metal churns in a chaotic dance, creating something we rarely notice yet utterly depend upon the Earth's magnetic field. It is our invisible shield, guarding life from cosmic radiation, solar storms, and the charged particles constantly hurled at us from space. For millions of years, this magnetic cloak has wrapped the planet in quiet protection. But it is not static. It shifts, weakens, wanders, and when it falters, the consequences ripple far beyond the sky. Ancient people may not have understood magnetism, but they knew when the sky changed. They knew when patterns broke, when light moved in strange ways, and when the heavens no longer behaved as they once had. The Earth's magnetic field is generated by the movement of liquid iron in the outer core. This process is turbulent, unpredictable, and dynamic. Over time, the poles drift. Occasionally, they reverse entirely north, become south, and vice versa. Between these reversals, the field can weaken, sometimes drastically. Today, we measure this with precision. We've watched the magnetic North Pole accelerate its movement toward Siberia. And we've documented the thinning field over the South Atlantic, a region now known as the South Atlantic Anomaly. Satellites passing through this zone experience interference. Astronauts report increased radiation. But thousands of years ago, such subtle changes would have been felt in different ways. Strange lights in the sky, disturbed weather, weakened crops, illness without clear cause. To ancient eyes, a weakening magnetic field would not appear as an abstract scientific concept. It would be interpreted through the lens of myth, ritual, and experience. Imagine auroras spreading far beyond their usual polar domains, dancing green and red, lights flickering over lands that had never seen them before. These spectral displays would have been awe-inspiring, even terrifying, to people whose cosmology tied the heavens to fate. Such events signaled disorder. In legends across cultures, we hear echoes of this memory of skies on fire, suns that changed color, stars that misbehaved. These stories may seem exaggerated, but they may also reflect true phenomena caused by increased solar radiation, penetrating a weakened shield. Geomagnetic instability is recorded not only in myth, but in the Earth itself. Ice cores and sediment layers preserve isotopes that spike during periods of heightened cosmic ray exposure. These chemical fingerprints match known intervals of magnetic weakening, and during these same periods, we see signs of environmental stress, climate anomalies, regional extinctions, human migration. In some regions, ecosystems collapse while others remain stable, creating imbalance and competition. Uneven hardship often drives conflict. Societies fracture not just from scarcity, but from disparity. When one region suffers while another thrives, tension grows. Ancient societies did not know the source of these stresses, but they responded to the symptoms. Some turned to ceremony, believing ritual could restore balance. Others relocated or reorganized. In Central American cultures, solar deities became central figures, representing not only life and light but danger and judgment. In East Asian cosmology, harmony between heaven and earth was crucial. Disruptions in the sky were taken as omens of political or ecological imbalance. These were not arbitrary beliefs. They were responses to real, observable changes in the environment, many of which may have stemmed from shifts in the planet's magnetic behavior. One of the most haunting aspects of geomagnetic weakening is its subtlety. It does not strike like a flood or burn like a drought. It unfolds quietly, altering the background conditions of life. Solar storms become more impactful. Radiation levels increase slightly, but steadily. Atmospheric chemistry shifts. Weather patterns behave oddly. Migratory animals become disoriented. Plant growth falters. Each of these changes alone might be survivable, but together they erode the foundations of civilization. The effects are slow, distributed, and difficult to trace. By the time a society realizes something is wrong, the disruption is already underway. From a human perspective, the loss of the magnetic shield would feel like betrayal. The sky, once a source of guidance and regularity, becomes erratic. The stars no longer align. The sun seems to scorch rather than nourish. The moon's path feels altered. Navigation fails, both literal and spiritual. In such moments, people turn inward. They seek reasons. They create stories to explain the inexplicable. And in those stories, we may find the remnants of knowledge too fragmented to survive as science, yet too vital to be forgotten entirely. The fragility of memory becomes a key theme here. A society might recognize that the sky has changed, but without understanding why. Its response may be misdirected. They may build temples, offer sacrifices, reorganize their calendar, all in an effort to restore a balance that is beyond human influence. And yet, these acts are not meaningless. They represent an attempt to preserve awareness, to encode a warning. The sun grew violent. The sky burned. The seasons shifted. Remember this. Act accordingly. Even if the details are lost, the shape of the story survives. When stability returns, as it often does, urgency fades. The shield strengthens. Auroras retreat to the poles. Weather normalizes. And with that return, memory softens. The great disruptions become legend, then fable, then nothing. But the Earth does not forget. Its core continues to churn. Its field continues to wander. The next weakening begins, unnoticed at first, and the cycle repeats. This is why some ancient civilizations may appear strangely advanced and strangely silent. They understood more than we give them credit for. But their knowledge was brittle. It cracked under the weight of convergence when too many cycles aligned at once. Today, we track the magnetic field with satellites and sensors. We monitor solar storms. We model what a future reversal might look like. But our infrastructure, our power grids, our communication systems, our navigation remains deeply vulnerable. A single massive solar event during a weakened field could cripple satellites, disable electric systems, and disrupt global trade. In such a scenario, we would be forced to remember what our ancestors once tried to tell us, that the sky is not always our ally. If lost civilizations were guided by Earth's cycles, then the behavior of the magnetic field would have been among the most difficult to understand and the most dangerous to forget. It left few obvious signs. Its effects were indirect. Yet its role was fundamental. When the shield weakened, the rules changed. And for societies already stressed by other forces, climate shifts, floods, droughts, it may have been the final weight that caused collapse, not as a single catastrophe, but as a slow erosion of safety. The sky turned hostile, and those who survived did so not through conquest, but through remembrance. The shield is still here, for now, but it is changing. Its drift has accelerated. Its strength has diminished. And while modern science watches closely, we are still just beginning to understand the full range of its influence. Ancient stories once dismissed as fiction may yet hold meaning we have overlooked, because while the magnetic field cannot be seen, its loss can be felt. In the crops that wither, in the skies that burn, in the silence left behind when the world no longer makes sense. The vanishing shield is a cycle like any other. It does not promise safety. It only promises return. The sun, for most of human history, appeared to be the ultimate constant. It rose and set with unerring precision. It warmed the land, nourished the crops, dictated the length of days, and provided the energy upon which all life depends. Civilizations across time revered it not just as a source of light, but as the foundation of existence. Temples were built to face it. Festivals were timed by its solstices. Gods were imagined in its blazing image. But behind its brilliance hides a more complicated truth. The sun is not constant. It pulses. It changes. It breathes energy in cycles that can bless or destroy. And ancient people, though lacking our modern instruments, knew this not by looking directly at the sun, but by watching the world change under its rhythm. The solar cycle, an approximately 11-year pattern of rising and falling magnetic activity, governs the sun's behavior. During its quiet phase, the sun is calm. During its active phase, it erupts with solar flares and coronal mass ejections, vast bursts of plasma and energy that fly across the solar system. When one of these events strikes Earth, it shakes the planet's magnetic field, energizes the upper atmosphere, and induces electrical currents in the ground. In the modern age, these surges can disable satellites, knock out power grids, and scramble communication networks. In the ancient world, their impact was subtler but no less real. A solar storm does not scorch the earth with fire. Its effects are invisible to the eye but present in the results. Climate patterns shift. Atmospheric chemistry is altered. Crop yields fluctuate without obvious cause. Animal behavior changes. Water cycles stutter. To ancient observers, these irregularities would not have been recognized as solar in origin, but they would have been noticed. A season that began with promise might end in blight. Rains might come too early, or not at all. Herds might refuse to follow their usual paths. Bees might vanish. Birds might scatter. And without a visible source for these disruptions, people turned to the sky for answers, and often found them in the figure of the sun. It is no coincidence that solar deities across civilizations often represent both creation and destruction. In Egypt, Ra journeys through the sky by day and the underworld by night, holding back chaos with each cycle. In Mesoamerica, the sun was tied to cycles of death and rebirth, where previous worlds had ended in catastrophe when solar balance failed. In Hindu tradition, solar avatars brought both healing and war. These dualities were not contradictions, they were expressions of lived experience. The sun gave life, but it could also disrupt it. Its energy brought fertility, but when imbalanced, brought ruin. People remembered not only the light, but the shadow that sometimes followed. The historical record offers hints of solar-linked collapses. Tree ring data and ice cores show that solar minima, periods of unusually low solar activity, often align with climate anomalies. The Maunder minimum, a prolonged solar lull during the 17th century, coincided with the Little Ice Age in Europe, a time of failed harvests, famine, and social unrest. Earlier, during the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, solar and geomagnetic disruptions may have contributed to a breakdown of complex societies across the Mediterranean and Near East. Trade routes vanished, cities were burned, writing systems were lost. The collapse was not due to one cause but a convergence of stresses, some of which may have been solar in origin. What makes solar cycles particularly dangerous is their ability to amplify other crises. A mild drought becomes devastating if it strikes during a solar minimum that suppresses rainfall. A disease spreads farther if it coincides with changes in ultraviolet radiation that affect immune responses. A migration becomes conflict if disrupted animal patterns lead multiple groups to the same resource-poor region. Solar activity does not need to be the spark. It only needs to be the wind that turns a flicker into a blaze. Ancient peoples could not predict solar flares, but they may have recognized recurring rhythms. In cultures with long-standing oral traditions, there are stories of the sun changing its face, of periods when it lost strength or burned too fiercely. Some of these tales describe skies that grew dim, crops that withered under a pale sun, or plagues that followed unusual solar behavior. Others speak of the sun raging in anger, of fire from the sky, of skies lit at night. To modern ears, these sound like allegory, but in the context of solar cycles, they may preserve memory of real environmental shifts. Understanding the sun's role in civilization's fortunes adds a new dimension to ancient reverence. It was not blind worship, it was attention. Watching the sun was watching for change, aligning monuments to solstices, tracking shadows on temples, carving solar calendars into rock. All of these were acts of vigilance, a society that noticed when the sun rose slightly differently, or when the heat came too soon or too late, gained precious time to adapt. It could delay planting, increase storage, avoid unnecessary travel. This kind of knowledge was survival. But like all memory, solar knowledge was vulnerable to interruption. A few generations of calm, and the stories lost urgency. The rituals remained, but their meanings faded. The calendars persisted, but their adjustments stopped. And when the sun pulsed again, when the world shifted under its heat or dimness, the lessons had to be relearned the hard way. This is how civilizations rise with the sun and fall in its shadow, forgetting not that the sun exists, but that it changes. In today's world, we track solar storms with spacecraft. We map the sun's surface in high definition. We know the signs of an impending coronal mass ejection, yet we remain vulnerable. Our civilization is more dependent on electromagnetic systems than any before it. A major solar event, timed poorly, could crash financial networks, disable satellites, and darken cities. It would not be the end of the world, but it could be the beginning of a long, slow reset. The sun has not changed. It still pulses. It still breathes. What has changed is how we relate to it. Ancient cultures built their lives around its cycles. We build our power grids beneath them. They saw it as a god, a force of judgment. We see it as background, but it is neither enemy nor friend. It is a cycle, a pulse, a reminder that even the most familiar force in our lives moves to rhythms larger than any calendar. If lost civilizations were guided by Earth's cycles, then the sun was their most consistent teacher. It illuminated more than land, it illuminated time. It showed when to act, when to rest, when to wait, when to fear. Those who listened survived longer. Those who forgot were reminded, sometimes gently, sometimes not. The solar pulse continues. Whether we move with it or against it remains a question of memory. And the sun, as always, will wait for our answer. The moon is a quiet presence, steady and luminous, hanging in the sky like a silent observer of human time. To ancient civilizations, it was not just a light in the darkness. It was a ruler of rhythm, a force of pull and release, whispering through the tides, guiding the oceans, and shaping the boundaries between land and sea. Its gravitational influence is subtle but absolute, drawing waters into motion with a power that can lift whole coasts and drain entire bays twice each day. To those who lived near the sea, and most early civilizations did, this gentle force was not mysterious. It was law. Tides dictated daily life. Fish arrived and departed in rhythm with the moon. Boats set sail with the outgoing current and returned with the flood. Fields near rivers were planted according to the moon's phases. In coastal communities, the moon was a more reliable clock than the sun, which varied with season. The moon's cycle was constant, returning every 29.5 days with dependable precision. Over generations, this became not just observation, but embedded knowledge. Temples, calendars, and myths were crafted around it, marking its phases, its eclipses, its alignments with planets and stars. The moon was a companion and a guide, but beneath its regular phases lies a deeper motion, one less obvious, yet more impactful over long periods, roughly every 18.5 years. The moon's orbit slowly shifts in orientation in a cycle known today as the lunar nodal cycle. This movement changes how the moon's gravitational pull aligns with that of the sun, amplifying or diminishing tidal extremes. When this cycle peaks, high tides grow higher, low tides fall lower, and coastlines are pushed to their limits. To ancient peoples, these periods were not defined by astronomy, but by experience. Years when the sea reached farther inland, when salt crept into fresh water, when storms brought floodwaters into places once considered safe. Modern science can measure these cycles precisely. Ancient people measured them by memory. Oral traditions from coastal regions often tell of years when the sea came without warning, when the tides were wrong, when entire villages were washed away despite generations of settlement. In some cultures, these floods are remembered as punishments from the gods. In others, as the anger of the sea or the moon. Across Polynesia, stories tell of waves that crossed entire islands. In the British Isles, ancient legends speak of drowned cities and bells that can still be heard beneath the water. In Southeast Asia, flood myths abound, some attached to moral tales, others simply as warnings. The sea, they say, always comes back. These stories are not coincidence. They align closely with the science of lunar amplification. When the moon's pull aligns with rising sea levels, the result is not just higher tides, but far more frequent and damaging floods. And when background sea levels are already elevated as they are, now these amplified tides can breach barriers that held firm for centuries. Ancient civilizations, lacking flood defenses, adapted in different ways. Some built raised platforms and elevated cities. Others abandoned low-lying lands and retreated to higher ground. Still others encoded their experience into rituals and monuments, aligning sacred spaces with lunar phases, teaching their descendants to watch the sky before trusting the sea. Architecture offers clues. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats rose high above flood-prone plains. In Mesoamerica, temples were built atop mounds. In South Asia, early cities like Mohenjo-Daro had elevated citadels and sophisticated drainage systems, suggesting a recurring need to manage water intrusion. These were not purely spiritual designs. They were responses to a world where the ocean's behavior could not be assumed. When the moon's influence intensified, it tested every assumption. Crops failed from salt intrusion. Wells turned brackish. Trade routes washed out. The consequences were cumulative, each storm a little worse than the last. Each generation forgetting a little more of the previous one's warning. This forgetting, as always, is the hinge between resilience and collapse. The moon's nodal cycle is long enough that few living people experience its full effects more than once. A catastrophic flood might occur in a parent's youth, then not again until their grandchildren are grown. Without written records, the memory decays. The cause becomes unclear. The story becomes symbolic. And in the meantime, people return to the same vulnerable shores, drawn by the fertility of deltas, the richness of estuaries, the trade routes of rivers. They build anew on forgotten ruins, and the moon continues its quiet revolution, preparing the next peak. We live in such a time now. The next peak in the lunar nodal cycle is due in the mid-2030s. Scientists predict an increase in tidal flooding across many coastal cities, not because the moon has changed, but because sea levels have. In the ancient world, these alignments were disruptive. In our world, they may be catastrophic. Modern cities sit atop concrete and steel, not elevated mounds. Their infrastructure is rigid. Their populations vast. They are optimized, not adaptive. And when the sea arrives at the wrong time, under the wrong moon, the damage may not be symbolic. It may be permanent. Ancient cultures understood that water was not a passive element. It moved with memory. It remembered the pull of the moon. It returned to places it had claimed before. This understanding was not mystical, it was observational. They knew that coastlines shift, that floodplains are temporary, that no wall holds forever. And so they built not for eternity, but for rhythm, for return. Their stories reminded people to be wary of the sea, to listen to the moon, to question stability. These are not superstitions. They are strategies for enduring in a world where the boundaries between land and ocean are never fixed. Collapse caused by lunar cycles is rarely sudden. It unfolds as a slow attrition. First, occasional floods, then yearly ones. Then salt in the soil, failure in the fields, disease in standing water, trade slows, wealth declines, people move inland, leaving behind crumbling walls and overgrown ports. Centuries later, new settlers arrive, unaware of what came before. They find myths and mounds, perhaps alignments they do not understand. They rebuild. The cycle continues. The moon does not flood the world alone, but it changes the odds. It aligns with other forces, rising temperatures, melting glaciers, expanding seas, and it magnifies them. The tides grow taller. The warnings grow clearer. Whether we hear them or ignore them is the difference between memory and amnesia. Ancient civilizations heard the moon's message. Some survived, some did not, but all left behind a pattern, a rhythm carved into coastlines, whispered through floods, marked in stone. We are not immune to that rhythm. The moon still turns, the tides still rise, and the ocean, like time, is patient. Collapse is rarely a moment. It is not a single fire, a lost battle, or a vanishing city. It is a process, a slow compression of options, a quiet erosion of memory, a narrowing of futures. It arrives not when everything ends, but when continuity breaks, when stories no longer align with the seasons, when calendars lose their relevance, when people look to the sky for guidance and see only silence. To understand collapse, we must stop seeing it as failure. We must see it as reset, as the point in the cycle where what was built begins to yield, not to destruction, but to transformation. Ancient civilizations that rose in rhythm with the Earth's cycles often collapsed, not because they were unaware, but because they were overmatched. They tracked the stars, honored the tides, timed their crops to the phases of the moon, and built their temples to align with solstice and equinox. They remembered floods, ice, fire, wind. They carried the past forward through myth, architecture, and ritual. But the Earth is not governed by one cycle. It is a layered symphony. Orbital shifts, solar rhythms, ocean pulses, atmospheric flows, magnetic shields. Each pattern is survivable alone. Together, they converge, and when they do, civilizations are tested in ways no story can fully prepare for. The archaeological record shows this clearly. Societies with complex infrastructure, skilled engineering, and rich culture often vanish not in violence, but in retreat. Granaries expand before abandonment. Canals are dug deeper, then left dry. Fortifications rise, not in confidence, but in desperation. These are not signs of ignorance. They are signs of strain, of knowledge stretched thin, of responses that came too late or too little. Adaptations meant for one crisis clashed with those required for another. When ice returned and the sky turned red, when the seas rose and rains failed, there was no singular solution, only convergence. Memory fractures in these moments. Oral traditions lose detail. Written archives are abandoned. Astronomers become priests. Scientists become shamans. Calendars continue to be followed long after their original alignment ceased to make sense. What began as strategy becomes ceremony. What was warning becomes legend. And what was once a map through time becomes a myth of origin. Future generations inherit fragments, a temple aligned to a forgotten star, a flood myth with no date, a tale of burning skies whispered with reverence but without understanding. When we look back at the ruins of these civilizations, we often focus on the sophistication of what they left behind, their mathematics, their stonework, their astronomical precision. But what we should see more clearly is what's missing: continuity. Their brilliance did not save them. Their knowledge was not immune to decay. The reset swept away context, and what emerged in its place were new societies, shaped not by inheritance, but by necessity. They built again, often atop the bones of the old world, with different priorities, different myths, and a different sense of time. This is why history often appears as a series of starts and stops, why advanced understanding seems to appear suddenly, then vanish without trace. Why monuments exist without inscriptions. Why stories survive without instruction. Collapse does not erase everything. It erases connection. A child born after the fall may walk among ruins, unaware that they are ruins. The past becomes landscape, and the reset becomes the new beginning. Modern civilization believes it has broken this cycle. That knowledge is now permanent, protected by servers, satellites, and global communication. That collapse is a thing of the past, confined to dusty empires and forgotten deserts. But permanence is not a guarantee. Our systems are vast, but also brittle. Our records are plentiful, but dependent on electricity. Our awareness is broad, but often shallow. And the forces that challenged ancient societies have not ceased. They have only accelerated. We live now in a moment of convergence, rising temperatures, shifting jet streams, intensifying solar activity, weakening magnetic fields, melting ice, surging seas. Each of these forces has shaped human history on its own. Together, they redefine it. Climate change is not a new cycle, it is the amplification of many old ones, sharpened by human industry and driven beyond their natural pace. The result is a global system pushed toward instability, one that mirrors the conditions of past collapses, but at a scale and speed never seen before. And yet, the danger is not only environmental, it is psychological. It is the belief that awareness alone is sufficient, that because we can model the future, we can master it. But ancient civilizations were also aware. They saw the signs. They adapted. They built systems to remember. What they lacked was not knowledge, but cohesion, the ability to respond collectively, decisively, and with humility. When the cycles converged, their societies fragmented, competing priorities, political divisions, cultural inertia, all made decisive action impossible. The same patterns echo in the present. Today, warnings are widespread, but action is inconsistent. Institutions debate rather than decide. Long-term thinking is sacrificed to short-term gain, and as each year passes, the convergence deepens. This does not guarantee collapse, but it does echo with familiar rhythms, the slow closing of options, the rising cost of inaction, the fraying of shared narratives. What comes next depends not just on what we know, but on what we are willing to change. The lesson of Forgotten Worlds is not despair. It is perspective. It is the understanding that civilizations are not undone by ignorance alone, but by forgetting how to live within limits. That knowledge must be practiced to endure. That memory must be renewed, not just recorded. The people who built sky-aligned temples, who told stories of fire and flood, who watched the moon and feared the sea, they were not primitive. They were participants in a conversation with the earth, one we have interrupted, but can still resume. We still have choices. We can rebuild continuity. We can treat cycles as reality, not background. We can design systems that bend with change rather than break. We can anchor knowledge in places that outlast devices in culture, in design, in community. We can choose to remember not just what came before, but how it ended. And in doing so, we can extend the moment between reset and collapse. We can lengthen the cycle. We can survive it. But to do so, we must abandon the illusion that we are the final chapter. We must see ourselves as one phase in a much longer pattern, governed not by certainty, but by rhythm. The earth does not end. It turns. It forgets. It begins again. The question is not whether collapse is coming. It is whether we will recognize it as familiar, whether we will respond not with panic, but with memory, whether this time We will remember enough to change the ending. Because the clock is still ticking, the sky is still shifting, the ocean is still rising, and the moon is still pulling at the edges of our illusion of control. The reset is not coming. It has already begun. What remains to be seen is who we will be on the other side.